Welcome to ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. This is Alice Lee Hagan. As you may all know, today, Iran and the world powers struck an initial agreement on the framework on the nuclear talk that started back in November 2013. While many details have yet to be resolved by June this year, the initial framework was surprisingly specific and comprehensive about the next steps in limiting Tehran's nuclear program. President Obama proclaimed that the framework was a good deal and that it meets our core objectives. Iran Foreign Minister, Mr. Javad Zarif, described the deal as a win-win situation or agreement. The EU Foreign Policy Chief said that a decisive step has been achieved. So what does that all mean, and what are the implications of this agreement or this framework of an agreement to the world, and what does it mean for businesses? So to provide some perspective and insight on this recent breakthrough, my guest today is Farideh Farhi. She is an affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She has taught comprehensive politics or comparative politics at the University of Colorado Boulder, University of Tehran, and Shahid Beheshti University, Tehran, and I'm sorry for butchering the pronunciation. She has also published numerous articles and book chapters on comparative analysis of Iranian politics and foreign policy. She has been a public policy scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and consultant to the World Bank and the International Crisis Group. Farideh, welcome to our show, and it is amazing that I have you scheduled for today to be able to talk about this breakthrough agreement.
Absolutely. The negotiations have been going on for 8 straight days. It's supposedly a historic negotiations in terms of the time spent trying to figure things out. It is apparently the longest an American Secretary of State has spent negotiating since World War I.
Oh my goodness.
Last night, Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif spent the whole night, 6 hours straight, talking and trying to figure things out. They slept for a couple of hours and then they started negotiating again. And what they have is what they called a framework for an agreement that is expected to happen by June 30th.
Now, this is a marathon negotiation, but I just want to let the audience know that it's not only Secretary Kerry and Foreign Minister Zarif who didn't get much sleep. You didn't get much sleep either trying to follow the story.
Absolutely. Not only that, I think most of the people who are connected one way or another to Iran, the Iranians did not sleep either. Everybody, it's a much bigger issue for Iranians because the sanctions regime that has been imposed on Iran has been devastating the population in many important ways. So this was a much bigger deal from the Iranian side that it would finally come through. And it's also the fact that it's not only United States and Iran negotiating, although United States agreement was probably much more important. This was negotiations between Iran and P5+1, 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, plus Germany, as well as the EU policy chief, Ms. Mogherini. So it was a very, very intense process that involved the Iranians on one side and 6 major powers on the other side. And for the Iranians, it was a big deal. It has never happened in this way anywhere in recent memory. And
if I could interrupt you now, you've told us about the process, and this is really a very significant milestone for Iran. But let's go back a little bit, even before this discussion on the nuclear talks. Could you tell us a little bit about the relationship between the U.S. and Iran, and actually Iran and the rest of the world?
Well, the most significant one, I mean, one has to go back to at least the Iranian Revolution. I mean, certainly United States and Iran were allied powers for a very long period of time. Iran was a very key component of American foreign policy in the region, in maintaining security in the region. But then once the revolution happened, that relationship took a turn for the worse because of the past history. United States had been involved in staging a coup against the democratic government in 1950. And then after the revolution, Iranians, there was the hostage crisis, the Iranians taking American diplomats hostage, and then United States supporting Saddam Hussein in the war against Iran. So there's quite a bit of bad blood in this relationship. So the problem between United States and Iran goes well beyond Iran's nuclear program. But this particular set of negotiations has been focused on Iran's nuclear program, and it's something that once President Obama was elected, he seriously pursued, both in terms of pressuring Iran through a sanctions regime as well as trying to negotiate a way out of it. In Iran as well, the dynamics were as such that once the 2013 election occurred and someone who was in favor of negotiations with United States, direct negotiations with the United States, was elected, the path was open for a very serious process of discussion.
And I guess that's why the negotiations started back in November 2013 then.
Absolutely. It actually, in November 2013, an initial agreement was reached.
Oh, okay.
Which was called a joint plan of action. And that initial agreement essentially froze or temporarily froze the extent Iran was enriching its uranium. And in exchange for very modest sanctions relief. So that joint plan of action has been in effect. Iranians have not enriched beyond 5%.
Oh, okay.
They have suspended the 20% enrichment, and every month Americans have allowed the release of Iranian funds, a very small amount, something like $450 million every month. But that was an initial agreement. This is a framework that essentially gives us a clue about what the final agreement would look like. And of course there are disagreements, from both sides in terms of how it would look like. Not everything has been worked out, but it's very clear that there will be limitations on Iran's program, both in terms of the extent of enrichment as well as the amount of enrichment. There's also going to be quite a bit of inspection, very, very rigorous inspection regime, but then United States is also making a commitment, if Iran maintains its commitment to not only reduce sanctions, but eventually lift all the nuclear-related sanctions against Iran. Now, United States Congress has a whole series of sanctions that are not related to Iran's nuclear program. They are related to, for example, to human rights in Iran. Those will not be lifted, and the Iranians were not interested in those, knowing that there might be quite a bit of opposition in Congress. What they are interested in are the United Nations sanctions that are connected to Iran's nuclear program, as well as European sanctions.
That's amazing. You can't talk about the nuclear negotiation without talking about the sanctions, but I'd like to hold off on the sanction. You mentioned the framework and then the final agreement. So right now, the agreement was on the framework.
Absolutely.
Right? And then there's a final agreement that has to be worked through by June. So we only have 3 months.
Absolutely.
And what do you see may be some of the challenges?
Well, there are 2 areas of challenges that I can see when I compare the 2 fact sheets that the 2 sides have given out.
What do you mean by that?
As soon as the agreement, the framework was announced, both the Iranians in Persian introduced their own fact sheet about what what the framework looks like. United States government did the same thing, and they're different. At least they are quite different in terms of the emphasis.
Can you tell us what the differences
Well, the main
are?
difference is that United States emphasizes limitations, and the time frame is much longer than the Iranians are suggesting, while the Iranian fact sheet emphasizes immediate lifting of sanctions. And and the American fact sheet is much vaguer on the question of when sanctions will be lifted. So because in effect both sides are responding to their own domestic audience. The Iranian hardliners are very concerned about limitations on Iran's program, and also they think that if there's going to be limitations, all the sanctions have to be lifted immediately. Therefore, the fact sheet that the Iranians have introduced essentially introduces the ideas in those terms. While in the United States, the opposition essentially is very much interested in reducing Iran's nuclear program as much as possible. I mean, there are members of Congress very close to the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu who think that Iran should not be allowed to enrich any uranium. This framework agreement is actually quite specific that Iran will be allowed to run over 5,000 centrifuges, which is much larger than what people thought before. So there's going to be opposition to that. And because of that, the fact sheet in the United States emphasizes other limitations that the Iranians may not necessarily agree.
Oh my goodness.
So there are issues to be worked out, and obviously, they were not worked out because it was very clear that they were trying to come up with a final agreement, if possible, but they were not able to.
So as you commented earlier on, a lot of the fact sheets, I guess on the US side and on Iran's side, they are very much driven by their home front. So I guess fast forwarding it 3 months from now, what do you think would possibly happen?
I think obviously there is a possibility of a breakdown. There is a possibility that there is so much opposition on both sides that everything falls apart. But there is also a real possibility that as people see the framework and the potential for a peaceful resolution of this conflict, that the positive reactions that have occurred, and they have already occurred. For example, in Iran, in the streets, people are honking and are quite happy because they want to get rid of the kind of news that has been created around Iran. In the United States, also, you see quite a lot of editorials that are going to come out, are going to be quite critical. There is no doubt that there are hardliners on both sides.
Right.
And, for example, the Republican leadership in Congress has effectively said that no agreement with Iran that allows even, one centrifuge spinning is an acceptable one. And that is why, if you listen to both President Obama or Secretary Kerry, they talk about how unrealistic that scenario is. And given its lack of realism, the opponents of the deal in the United States are obligated to come up with a realistic alternative that is not bombing Iran.
Right. Now, of course, as you said, a few days ago when the deadline of March 31st came and went, when I was just researching the stories, you see a lot of words like doubt, skepticism, a lot of negativity, really wondering what came about from this nuclear talk. But of course, today people would use the word euphoria and it's a breakthrough and all that. But you also mentioned the opposition. So how big is the opposition on both sides, in the U.S. and in Iran?
The latest polls in the United States, let's acknowledge that there is not an equality here. In the sense that the deal is much more important to the Iranians. So I would assume that 90% of Iranians were watching President Obama, who was shown live for the first time on American TV today, while, in the United States, barely, 10% of the population saw, I would even be surprised at that. So there is no equality in that sense.
And on that note, I actually would like to add that before I came to this interview, I was looking through a lot of the video clips. Actually, I saw an Iranian person. I guess in Iran, they had President Obama making the announcement, and he took a selfie of him with Obama on TV in the background.
Absolutely. So this was a first. So, understand the imbalance here in terms of power, in terms of interest, in terms of the importance of the issue to particular countries. In Iran, there was an election just very recently, and a candidate that explicitly said that he was going to try to resolve the nuclear issue won handily. Now, it's true that he only won by 51%, but he was running against 4 or 5 other candidates. None of the other candidates got more than 10 or 15%. So, and the hardliners barely got 10%. And that's where the core of opposition to any nuclear deal that limits Iran's program comes into play. In the United States, just recently, there has been a poll, and the poll has shown that a large part of the American population doesn't even know what's going on, have no interest. But among the people that know that there is negotiation is going on, 2 to 1 favor nuclear negotiations. So the terrain has shifted. And, remember, this is a terrain that included the Prime Minister of Israel coming to United States Congress in an unprecedented fashion, arguing against the President of the United States. And it didn't work in that way. It didn't prevent the kind of agreement or framework that just happened.
Farideh, why don't we take a break? But when we come back, I'd like to ask you about the implications of this framework on, I guess, the rest of the world in terms of the negotiating powers that participated in the negotiation, and of course the Middle East region. What would be some of the implications?
Okay.
Great. My guest is Farideh Farhi. She is an affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and we have been talking about the Iran-U.S. nuclear talk that got its breakthrough today. Please join us. We'll be right back after the break.
Aloha, I'm Keli'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ahana Kako, a weekly program on the ThinkTech Hawaii broadcast network. Ahana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right, and what's good, and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ahana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to ThinkTech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the ThinkTech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ahana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My name is Alice Lee Hagan, and my guest today is Farideh Farhi. She is an affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Before the break, we have been she has been sharing with us her perspective on today's Iran and the talk about the nuclear talk today between Iran and the P5+1. So Farideh, before the break, you gave us a very quick overview of the relationship between Iran and U.S. and of course what this framework meant to Iran, and you commented that this is actually a more significant breakthrough for Iran and the Iranian government. And before we actually took the break, you mentioned Israel, and I'm interested in your perspective on how, what this means to the region there.
Well, what it means will have to be worked out. What is clear at this particular moment is that Iran's strategic rivals in the region, countries that essentially compete for influence in the region, are very worried about this agreement. In particular, countries such as Israel as well as Saudi Arabia. I mention them as strategic rivals because essentially most of the time people talk about this in terms of religious rivalry and so on, but in reality what is going on is quite a bit of competition for influence among these countries in the region, as well as the fact that the animosity between United States and Iran has been a very important tool for countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel, who essentially are fearful of losing their very close relationship with the United States, and the reality that United States has been a protector of the status quo in the region with an improved relationship between Iran and United States. The animosity between United States and Iran has been a very important instrument for these powers to, for example, get foreign aid from United States, buy military equipment from United States, pursue policies that prevents them essentially from engaging in internal reform. For example, Mr. Netanyahu, instead of dealing with the Palestinian issue, constantly talks about Iran being a danger. The same dynamic is at play in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has internal problems in terms of its minority population and so on. And by in effect, constantly worrying or identifying Iran as the main threat in the region, those issues can be set aside. This agreement essentially brings Iran out of the kind of isolation that it has been placed, and in many ways prevents other countries to constantly talk about Iran as being a dangerous country in the region.
Could you then share with us what is Israel's perspective after the deal? The deal came through. How do they feel? And Saudi Arabia.
Well, Israel is in the middle of just had an election, so effectively. The elected prime minister, who is the former prime minister, has yet not been able to put the government together. But he has been a strong opponent of any kind of agreement with the United States. The same dynamic is at play in relationship to Saudi Arabia. And in fact, many people suspect that the Saudi attack on Yemen, on the pretext that the Houthi minority that has effectively taken over and pushed out the government in Yemen as being Iranian-backed is very much part and parcel of this fear. So the region is in quite a bit of turmoil, but this turmoil is nothing new. It's a turmoil that essentially began to be, with the American invasion of Iraq, and the reverberation of that, we are still being played out, because what happened was that during the Bush administration's invasion of Afghanistan and Iran, two traditional enemies of Iran on both sides of Iran essentially were flipped and now have a much closer relationship to Iran. This was not an intended consequence of those two invasions, but that has been the result of those invasions. So other regional powers who had close relationship with the previous Iraqi government, previous Afghan government when it was under Taliban, like Saudi Arabia, have been unsettled since then. And they are trying very frantically to figure out a way to manage their interests as well as manage their rivalry with Iran. And opposing any kind of agreement has been very much part and parcel of that management process.
So now you commented that Saudi Arabia and Israel, they have been opposed to this discussion. The rest of the region, do you think, like the rest of the world, that perhaps they would see this as perhaps a beginning of a stabilizing?
Absolutely. I mean, the fact that Iran is negotiating with 6 great powers, 3 European powers, as well as the representative of the European Union, the foreign policy chief, is certainly reflective of the fact that the good chunk of the world is very much part and parcel, want stabilization of the Middle East and thinks that Iran coming out of its isolation is good for the region, and also thinks the other way, that this process of continuously imposing unbelievable sanctions, unprecedented sanctions on a country of close to 80 million people is dangerous. That is to say, it will also, if you do not do something about it, sanctions are not an alternative to war, they will eventually lead to war. And certainly the Middle East cannot afford another war, and certainly the United States or European powers or NATO cannot afford another war, having gone through several of them in the past decade.
Now, we've talked about the negotiation on this nuclear deal, and it has been about politics, foreign policy. But of course, it's tied to sanctions, and you've brought up that on a few occasions. And of course, sanctions are tied to the daily livelihood of Iranians, the business, the economy. And of course, that's something that I guess I have to admit that I'm more interested in. So tell us about the sanction. How has it been affecting an ordinary Iranian citizen?
Okay, let's first off get a good sense of what these unprecedented sanctions are
Yes,
about.
please.
Because first of all, let's be very clear. Iran is not an isolated country economically. Iran has been historically an oil-producing country. Iran has one of the largest oil companies in the world. It's a state-owned company, but it is one of the largest in the world. So it has been a connected country. It's not sort of a hermit kingdom, as some people define, for example, North Korea. So the kind of economic sanctions that have been imposed on Iran that include limitation on oil exports, but I think more importantly, financial sanctions, where effectively Iran was not able to get paid for the oil it exported. There was a sanctions regime on its central bank. Has created tremendous amount of problems for the Iranian population.
Wait, I'm sorry, I don't understand that. So the oil can still leave, but
yes,
they cannot receive payment.
Exactly, in dollars, because no bank will, unless you figure out, I mean, you take suitcases. There have been a couple of banks that have been doing in an underhanded way. Several banks have been punished and fined for doing that kind of activities. But effectively, that's what the sanction regime is about. Iran, I cannot even begin to tell you. For example, when I go to Iran, I cannot access my University of Hawaii Gmail account because if I have a personal Gmail account, I can access it. But because University of Hawaii is considered a business, I cannot access my Gmail University of Hawaii account unless I use a VPN. So people would not know where I'm accessing my account. So the level of sanctions regime imposed on Iran goes to that kind of detail. And families cannot send money to their children. If I go to Iran and try to be any person that goes to Iran and tries to access his or her account in United States, because I'm an American citizen, immediately the account will be shut down.
Farideh, tell us about that story about a year ago about Bank of Hawaii.
Absolutely.
Because at the end, sometimes, as you said, Americans may not be as concerned about the relationship between Iran, not as much as Iranians. But there is an effect on the U.S. and on the state of Hawaii. So tell us about that story.
Bank of Hawaii last year sent a letter, I think, to 17 Iranians and Iranian who are green card holders in the United States, not American citizens, essentially closing their accounts because they said that the sanction regime, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, essentially requires their bank to not give service to Iranians. Now, the law is written in such a way that says that any person in Iran, and because Bank of Hawaii did not have the software to assess whether or not any Iranian students who were at the University of Hawaii or Hawaii Pacific or even green card holders had they, were in Iran or not, if they accessed their accounts, they effectively shut down their accounts. Fortunately, the National Iranian American Council, as well as with the intervention of the Attorney General and the governor, we were able to find a way where Bank of Hawaii actually used the new software. But nevertheless, if I go to Iran and try to access my account in United States, my account will be immediate. And not only me, an Iranian, I'm an Iranian American, even a non-Iranian American, a tourist going to Iran will be unable to, as soon as the bank knows that the account is being accessed from Iran. Most of the Bank of America does that. So, these kind of broad-based sanctions that have been imposed, initially they were sold as being sanctions that are directed at the government of Iran. But in reality, they ended up being very broad-based and impacting the population. So, for example, you have ill people who need medicine. There is no sanction on critical medicine going to Iran, but because there are sanctions on the financial system, people cannot. A lot of the pharmaceuticals would not sell to Iran because Iran would not be able to pay them.
Well,
So,
Farideh, the sanctions are really far-reaching, and I don't know when they initiated this discussion on trade sanction, whether they would understand the implication of how far-reaching it would be. But let's continue talking about trade sanctions when we come back from our break.
Okay,
Great.
sounds good.
My guest is Farideh Farhi. She is the affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and we have been talking about the U.S. trade sanctions. You're watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My name is Alice Hagan. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Inspired by an ancient culture, classical Chinese dance, vigorous physicality, timeless stories, 5,000 years of Chinese music and dance, Shen Yun presents authentic Chinese culture. Coming to Blaisdell Concert Hall, May 8th and 9th. Tickets at shenyun.com or call 808-792-3919.
Hi, aloha. My name is Chris Leatham, and I host a show called The Economy and You. The show plays every Wednesday at noon, and on my show, I bring on guests who are interested or working in the technology space. And so I'd like you to come and watch the show and learn with me about all the sort of exciting things that we're doing in Hawaii to build and grow our economy ecosystem. So I'd like to say aloha, and I look forward to seeing you on the show. Thank you.
You're watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, my guest is Farideh Farhi. She is the affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Before the break, we have been talking about the recent U.S. nuclear trade talk and the trade sanctions that have been imposed on Iran and their implications. So Farideh, as we were talking earlier on, this trade sanction actually affected Iranian American citizens who are living here in the state of Hawaii. So now that there is a breakthrough in terms of an agreed upon framework to continue the discussion about what we can do to limit the, the nuclear program in Tehran. So what do you see coming out of this? And my question is really about what does it mean to businesses?
Well, the most important component in terms of businesses is the fact that when the sanctions are lifted, and these sanctions include both trade sanctions as well as investment sanctions as well as financial sanctions. So if indeed we reach a point where people begin to feel that sanctions are being lifted for good, then Iran is an amazing business opportunity for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's a very large country of close to 80 million people that are highly educated. They have sophisticated taste, they have cosmopolitan taste in terms of the goods that people want to buy.
And I have to interrupt you on that. When you say sophisticated, yes, and they're very well educated. In my work at the university, I've met engineers, business people, and there are a lot of graduate students who are from Iran. So I really respect the your education system.
Exactly. Some very good universities. You know, it's a competitive system, so the best and the brightest go and end up studying the more difficult fields, and so it's a live population. They want to do things. On top of that, you have an extremely resource-rich country. If you put Iran's oil and gas reserves together, it is probably the largest fossil fuel country in terms of its reserves. Iranians joke and say that they now have the second largest reserves of natural gas in the world after Russia, and this is when they have been under sanctions for 40 years and there haven't been any explorations. You know, as they have tried to get oil out, they have found these natural gas resources. So that is completely undeveloped in terms of international standards. Now, grant you, Iranian natural gas is part of the domestic consumption. Almost all the Iranian homes are fueled by natural gas, not petroleum. So, but in terms of turning it towards the international market, it requires quite a bit of investment from the outside. And it is not necessarily directed, that investment, towards the West. It can go towards East, India, and elsewhere. You know, the same thing in terms of development in oil production, although most energy analysts think that the future of Iran is in natural gas, not in oil.
So let's stay with this topic on energy and development on the energy sector. So who would the Iranian government, or who would Iran be working with? Would it be with U.S., the Europeans, or even the Chinese? What's your take on that?
I think it depends. I think the Iranians are open to all possibilities. One of the things that the sanction regime has done, you know, the French companies were there, Chinese companies were there, but because of the sanction regime, they slowly moved out. And of course, United States oil companies have been banned from investing in Iran since the Clinton administration. That has nothing to do with the nuclear energy sanctions. And now, as Iran opens up, it has had an opportunity to go through its contracts, oil contracts, and try to offer new ways to foreign companies for investment in Iran. I mean, let us not forget that Iran had a revolution 40 years ago, and part of that revolution, or the emphasis in that revolution, was economic independence and sovereignty. So part of the difficulties oil companies, European oil companies, have had in investing in Iran are sanctions, but a lot of it also had to do with the fact that the terms the Iranians were offering were not very appealing in comparison to other places. I think the Iranians have shifted on that, especially after what has happened in Iraq, because the close relationship between Iraq and Iran, and the Iranians have looked and seen what the Iraqis have been trying to do in terms of their oil contracts. So once the sanction regime gets lifted, the Iranians will actually introduce their new contracts to the world. They've been trying to do that for the past 18 months, but the Treasury Department in the United States has not allowed it to happen. A conference was supposed to happen in London 18 months ago, in which the Iranians would introduce their new contracts. But once there is this feeling that the sanctions are going to go away, that's the first thing that is going to happen in terms of the energy industry.
Now, we mentioned about this sanction against Iran, but then I read somewhere that China never imposed any type of sanctions with Iran. Can you clarify that?
See, the sanctions that the United States imposes are actually what is called extraterritorial. What it says to the Chinese company, obviously the United States cannot prevent Chinese companies from doing business. But it tells them that if they do business in Iran, then they cannot do business in the United States. Now, obviously, for a Chinese company, United States is a much bigger and more important market.
Right.
And they do not want to be faced with American fines. And that's the way United States has managed to prevent both oil companies as well as banks from operating in Iran through threatening them through these secondary or extraterritorial, that's what they are called, sanctions regime that it has imposed. And they are faced with very, very stiff penalties if they deal with Iran. These kind of sanctions are not imposed on trade necessarily. They are imposed on investment.
Oh, okay.
So, the sanction regime in Iran, if you go to Iran, you would not know that Iran is a sanctioned country. It is full of goods everywhere. I joke and I say Samsung is everywhere.
So how does that happen?
Because they are not really imposed on trade. Okay?
Understood.
So, and also you can do, for example, Iranians, United States has given partial exceptions to the Koreans to import oil from Iran. And of course, the Iranians, in that process, without exchanging currency, they import goods from Korea. The same dynamic happens in relationship to China. It's just that those countries are faced with again, a kind of sanction that is imposed on the United States in terms of the extent they can import oil from Iran. The same thing applies to Japan as well, because these three countries are very much, have traditionally been important partners of Iran in terms of Iranian oil exports.
Wow, Farideh, that is amazing. I mentioned to you last time, since you teach at the university, maybe one day I should come and take your class. So now, you've been a long-time observer of the U.S.-Iran relationship. So what drew you into this line of work at the beginning?
Well, what happened, I used to be a tenured faculty at University of Hawaii. I left and I went to Iran. When I taught at originally, I was what is called a comparativist, not necessarily focused on Iran, but teaching about different approaches to different countries. I wrote a book comparing Iranian and Nicaraguan revolution. Then I went to Iran, I stayed there for a few years, worked there, and then I came back and I thought the way people wrote about Iran was just so problematic and so wrong in terms of understanding of Iran. It just, it was so cartoonish. It was so flat. It was so, it's so misunderstood. The very, very dynamic society that was in Iran, that despite all the problems that were there in terms of the repression of the press or human rights, you had such a vibrant society and such an interesting state-society relationship that, ultimately I began writing about Iran and, in blogs as well as for others. And because of that, I ended up, before I knew it, as some sort of a someone who can write about Iran in ways that other people. But my only claim to fame in reality was that I was one of the few observers of Iran that had actually lived in Iran.
Oh, I see.
And, because this relationship between United States and Iran has been so strange that up to 2 years ago, In fact, a few years ago, Iranian and American diplomats could not be seen in the same room.
That's amazing.
There was a ban on American diplomats throughout most of the Bush administration for being in the same room with the Iranian diplomats. So beyond whether or not there is going to be an agreement between United States and Iran or P5+1, just the optics of Iranian Foreign Minister and American Secretary of State walking together in Lausanne, and talking jovially itself is just an amazing, amazing picture for many of us who have been watching U.S.-Iran relations.
I know that you are actually going to Iran tomorrow. So what do you expect you will see when you get there?
As I said, already Iranians are partying. This is a period, this is a very good period in Iran because Iranian New Year just happened. And so in Iranian New Year's, Iranians have 2 weeks of holiday.
Oh, wonderful.
It just finished. The weather is great. And so for me, at this particular moment, it's interesting to go and actually see what the reaction is going to be. Because, Iranians are a very, very contentious bunch. There's going to be, opposition to the nuclear deal. And there's going to be, I already know a lot of people are happy. So one has to, I'm very excited to go and see how this works out.
And I'm sure you'll share with us in your blog, and I look forward to reading it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Farideh, for being my guest today.
Okay.
Wonderful.
So pleased to be with you.
Thank you. My guest is Farideh Farhi. She is the affiliate graduate faculty at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and we have been talking about the Iran nuclear deal that had a big breakthrough today. You've been watching ThinkTech Hawaii Business Education Spotlight. My name is Alice Lee Hagen. Please join us for our program next week. Aloha.